Welcome to Navigating Community Change Trends. My name is Duncan Field, and I'm a community animator with the Tamarack Institute, and I'm very excited to introduce our discussion today with Vinod Rajasekaran on how cultural and technological trends are shaping the future of community change work. Now, just a few quick notes about Vinod. He's the CEO and publisher of Future of Good, a new digital content platform dedicated to illuminating stories, innovations, and trends shaping social impact in Canada. Future of Good also produces the Future of Good Summit, the premier gathering of impact-focused leaders and exploring trends and tensions to doing good well in the 21st century. He's the co-founder and executive director of Impact Hub Ottawa, the largest multi-sector social innovation environment in Canada's capital. He recently oversaw strategy and business model development as the founding manager director of Rideau Hall Foundation, chaired by former Governor General David Johnston. He also launched Canada's social R&D network as a fellow with SIG, working to seed ecosystem conditions to strengthen embedded R&D capacity in Canada's nonprofits. His groundbreaking work in social R&D is referenced around the world. Welcome, Vinod.
Thanks, Duncan. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to have you as well. And I would highly encourage anyone on the call afterwards to take a look at the Future of Good website if you haven't already. It's futureofgood.co. And before we got started, I was hoping you could just provide a bit of context to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here on this webinar with folks from across the country and probably even around the world, I don't know. I want to kind of paint a bit of a backdrop as we talk about some of these trends. And as we approach the 2020s, I think we're also approaching a tipping point for our craft. And I consider what we do a craft, and I use that word very intentionally. And notice I didn't say the word profession or sector, and I don't mean craft in the sort of the guilds or apprenticeship sort of sense of the word, but it is an art and a science, and it's people who practice this craft are both professionals and really passionate amateurs, and they aren't just from the charitable sector or the public sector, and they come from all kinds of different fields: arts, sciences, education, social services, justice, and so on. And it's made up of people and tech and wisdom and institutions and all kinds of different forms of capital. So a big question for us now is, how does our craft change as the world around us changes? And the world of impact in Canada and around the world is experiencing two things at the same time: massive growth and rapid change. Massive growth because there's some really interesting stuff happening, amazing things happening in this world of social impact, the rise of social enterprise, social innovation, co-working hubs, B Corps, design labs, incubators, mobile apps, social finance. All of this stuff is contributing to this growth, which is really exciting. But at the same time, we're also experiencing a rapid change. Demographic shifts are reimagining giving. The gig economy is reimagining work and work culture and workplaces. Reconciliation and decolonization is reimagining power and voice. Technology is reimagining social services. So there's some rapid sort of changes happening at the same time. And so in a world that is growing and changing faster than ever before, folks like us who are really dedicated to doing good deserve smarter insights. And there is so much courage, creativity, knowledge, and ingenuity across the world of social impact. Like every day, I'm absolutely blown away by it. And it's coming from the grassroots, coming from policy, from tech, from philanthropy, from the front line. But really, we've been too modest at illuminating and sharing the stories and shining a light on this really amazing work. So there's really sort of two sides to our work in storytelling and digital content. First is to shine a light on this extraordinary creativity and ingenuity in the world of impact through our stories. Stories on clean energy leadership in First Nations, explainers on the Social Finance Fund, looking at unpacking really interesting food security solutions, how toys build empathy. And it's also about shining a light on emerging trends and transformations through issue guides and digestible analysis. So there's a whole range of areas that we're unpacking on that front, everything from digital currency to activism in the workplace to where social impact real estate is going, to this emerging movement of platform cooperatives, and so much more. So really excited to tell you more about this, but I just want to kind of take a couple of minutes to paint a bit of the backdrop.
Vinod, that's really exciting because I think thinking about how technological or cultural trends impact the craft of doing social good it's so important, but it's also not something that everyone has the bandwidth or capacity to spend a lot of time investigating. And I guess that's where you and Future Good come in. You're the ones doing that and the ones that we can kind of turn to help inform what's coming next. And I think I think some of those trends and what's coming next can be a bit of a stressor for people because sometimes we don't have the capacity to take on the work that we have now. So it's so exciting to have a guest here to talk about those trends because it gives us somewhere to turn to get those insights and wisdom.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so why don't we jump in? Our first question or discussion point has to do with something you mentioned briefly, that idea of professionals, passionate amateurs, and machines. We want to talk a bit about how machine learning and artificial intelligence is impacting our ability to lead people and manage people, our networks, and our contacts.
Yeah, and I would kind of broaden that question a bit, I guess, because I think that the next decade, the questions that we're going to be asking of ourselves and of our craft is, what will work look like? What will work culture look like? Who has more intelligence? Where does capacity come from? Who leads? Who runs whom? These are the kinds of questions that we're exploring, and I think that fundamentally, in my conversations with boards and leadership of nonprofits and charities, that they're also exploring. And what's really interesting now is that there's a few things that are happening in this space that we're following closely, and I'll sort of touch on a couple of things. In the next kind of decade or so, about 46% of work activities across most of our industry sectors have the potential to be automated through artificial intelligence technologies. And the charitable sector is, of course, not immune. And it's not that jobs would become fully automated. Some would, but the proportion of individual work activities that could be automated is pretty significant. And that is the equivalent of about 7.5 million jobs across the country. And so when Uber and Lyft drivers went on strike recently, yes, they were protesting for better working conditions, but we were also experiencing the first wave of workers protesting the eventuality of being replaced by machines. And so, so the important questions for people practicing our craft are: what happens when a group of people becomes irrelevant? What happens when voices of people do not matter because people are simply not needed in a specific service delivery context, right? What happens to people in the margins? Like we have to start to understand what irrelevance and being replaced mean in the age of intelligent machines. Because most jobs in the next decade will be comprised of a mix of human and machine intelligence. And so you talked about, where will this capacity come from? It's actually going to, a lot of it is going to come from intelligent machines. But there is an important role for human creativity, human ethics, and really bringing more humanity into this craft. And as some of you may know, we used to have an HR council for the nonprofit and charitable sector. The new Senate report on the charitable sector highlighted this and actually called for reinstating this council. The council itself sort of, closed shop ages ago and moved into the Community Foundations of Canada, which I think where it's still housed. But it closed such a long time ago. Like this was before crowdfunding took off, before artificial intelligence went mainstream, before we all had Alexa in our homes, before there was blockchain, before the gig economy was a big deal, right? So when the HR Council comes out of hibernation, it's not really going to recognize the new world of work and work culture. And so, so an important kind of consideration for us is how can a renewed HR Council focus on charitable work in an AI world? So, think about it. Like, think about our work in the world, whether it's frontline, like mental health, or legal advice, or back office, like graphic design. The implications are huge. Like we published a really terrific piece on chatbots in health services. Folks like Accio Clinic are doing some really excellent work in this space, and this is really going to change and disrupt how machine intelligence works with human creativity. We also published a piece on back office automation, like graphic design, with platforms like Luca, which was, I think, used to be called LogoJoy. And so there are really interesting kind of technologies that are getting tested and developed and getting implemented. And I think it's up to us to figure out what is that that blend of human creativity and humanity with machine intelligence. And the big question for us is, like, are we ready for that? Because one of the big tensions that I'll say here that is of significance and consequence is, I did say earlier that our craft is made up of both professionals and passionate amateurs, and this has been a tension, for the last 20-ish years, right? Our craft has become more professionalized. You can go to colleges and universities and get a degree in social change and social innovation. You can take all kinds of courses in it, and this tension is going to get really interesting over the next decade between professionals and amateurs. And we recently published a piece on activism at the workplace, and this is a genuine concern for nonprofits and charities and foundations, because they're really struggling with this question of activism in the workplace, because a lot of them don't feel like advocacy and activism is part of their mission. And so, when staff are asking to take time off to participate in marches or, protests, or just kind of, express themselves in the streets, that's a question that folks are like, how do we manage this? And so the question for us, and this is, I think, going to be a space of really interesting tension, is how do you empower that in a healthy way, right? And this is a function of impact becoming a lifestyle, right? Mm-hmm. Where professionalism and passion really kind of have started to blend. And so there's going to be some really crazy tensions that we're going to have to navigate. Like, who's leading change? Is it professionals or is it amateurs? Who's taking credit, right? Like, just last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, we hosted Ian Capstick, founder of MediaStyle, on a Twitter chat on this, and he challenged us to think if professionals are taking credit for things activists did, right? And it's a very important question, right? So as we are transitioning and into embracing and incorporating machine learning technologies and artificial intelligence, our craft is going to face significant tensions, particularly as it has to do with the relationship between professionals practicing our craft and passionate amateurs.
That's really interesting, and that note about whether professionals are taking credit for the work of activists, I think is particularly interesting, especially as we look to different networks or aggregators, or even think about the work of the Tamarack Institute. One of the great benefits of working at the Tamarack Institute is I've had access to all sorts of really great groups of people that are doing really interesting work, and will highlight their work through case studies and things like that. But I can imagine that as we get into, whether artificial intelligence or machine learning can help find some of those interesting case studies, whether the people at the heart of that work will actually get the credit that they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's already some really interesting experiments happening in private foundations around the world, where, in addition to sort of grant review committees and granting committees looking at what are the areas that we should be investing our charitable dollars and our granting dollars in, they supplement that with machine intelligence, and where you have algorithms sort of scanning for really interesting and worthwhile places based on a whole bunch of kind of data that say, here's issues of significance and importance, and given the work that we've done in the past and the performance of that work, here's areas that we could consider investing in the future.
Yeah, do you find that that has the potential to get kind of complicated or problematic in the sense that even more so than perhaps it already is, things like grant making would be even more tied to key performance indicators or certain metrics as opposed to other kind of qualitative aspects?
I think that's an important consideration for us. But where there is a huge potential is, if you could have a Watson box, scan all of the research that is happening in youth suicide prevention across the country, and give you a sense of here's where there are some really interesting advancements, and if you're a foundation or a charity looking to do work in this space, recommend rather, based on all the research that the Watson box has analyzed, synthesized, and processed, gives you, here's 5 areas where if we, put energy toward, resources toward, as it has to do with preventing youth suicides, here's where we could get some really interesting traction. Like, I think that is helpful and useful. Doesn't mean we have to, follow that, but these are recommendations. The other thing that, and this is an actual story where, there's a granting nonprofit who, it was really interested in investing some dollars in inclusion, particularly as it has to do with elderly folks. There's this really interesting story where the data showed that the actual need was in the east side of the city, but the granting dollars went to a charity in the west side of the city. And when the folks were asked, well, why is that? Well, they said, well, the organization on the west side of the city applied, and folks in the east side didn't.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So how can you kind of really blend these practices and take advantage of the recommendations that machine intelligence can offer us? I think that's a really interesting kind of opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about how things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the impact of technology in this sense in general, do you focus on the tensions, or are you optimistic about how we can kind of blend our practices to have a bigger impact?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think there's a bigger sort of question in here where I would sort of say that tech is really becoming a part of all aspects of our lives and work, building a healthy bridge and connection between tech and social impact is a huge focus for us, right? So the question of what does it mean to create impact in an increasingly digital world, this is probably one of the most significant questions of our craft right now. It doesn't matter, like there's all kinds of emerging technologies, and it really doesn't matter, whether it's artificial intelligence or virtual reality or robotics or blockchain. Some of these might sound strange, and we might even kind of wonder, do they actually belong in the world of social change? But there really is no social change without tech in the 21st century. And also keep in mind, like, there's a whole generation of people now who are digital natives, and so there's an expectation that social change involves and incorporates tech, right? But the thing, though, is so far, by and large, we have been playing defense when it comes to emerging technologies, right? So, and the conversations that we are having are largely focused on privacy issues and ethics and surveillance capitalism and all this sort of stuff, and they're really important conversations. And maybe playing defense is a good strategy, because lots of right questions, there's lots of good questions, but it doesn't help us maximize the opportunities and actually shape this space in a significant way, because we have so much to contribute to this space. And we can use technology to shape our social services, our cities, our education, our privacy, and so much more, right? And so when Vector Institute for AI in Toronto was launched, like, there were no charities listed as partners. Why is that? Right? Same thing when Element AI was launched. Same thing. And this is how we don't get to shape the future. And the thing is nonprofits and charities, we have so much to contribute to this space. We have the talent, we have lived experience, we have ethical frameworks, we have data, we have tech expertise. We have so much to contribute. And so, we're really interested in how we can offer some important digestible insights on what our contributions can be and how we can shape emerging technologies and their potentials in a variety of social change contexts. From water conservation to food security to refugee resettlement, education, etc. And work with organizations like Vector Institute in Toronto, or Element AI in Montreal, or the Blockchain Association of Canada. But it requires us going from really, reorienting ourselves from just playing defense to really kind of changing our posture when it comes to emerging technologies, and understanding that we have the power to shape it, and we can harness it as well. So there's a whole range of content that we have put together on this space. We published a 3-article series on artificial intelligence in the social sector, and really made a case that, listen, this is not an evil thing, and we can actually shape it and harness it for good. And there's lots more to come on that. We published kind of a state of play piece on this really exciting emerging space of platform cooperatives, where platform technologies, things that Uber and Airbnb are kind of based on, and the sort of the cooperative values, those two are kind of getting mashed up and are coming together. And this is a huge opportunity for tech in social impact. And so we did profiles on Eva, which is a ride-sharing app, but it's a co-op. And they're doing some really exceptional work. Airbnb is another rental co-op that is really crushing it in Europe. So this is a major focus for us, and expect lots of juicy content in this space.
Yeah, that's great. And I know we've already kind of been in this space and talking about this, the idea that there is no social change without tech, and how can the social sector get to the front of the tech curve and impact the shape of emerging tech, or will emerging tech shape the social sector? How would you say, as we kind of continue in that discussion, what would you suggest in terms of getting involved in that discussion? Because I think for a lot of people listening, they might have questions about, well, I don't directly know how to get involved with them. There might be monetary concerns, time concerns. What would you suggest for organizations kind of stepping into this world?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think in most kind of medium-sized cities and large cities in the country, there are all kinds of tech communities, and there's in some there are also tech for good communities, right? And so you think about the work that a lot of folks are doing in smart cities. Those are really kind of a mashup of people who have a deep passion for city building and for improving lives, but also have an expertise in data and tech and user experience and all of that. So, like one of the pieces that we actually did was looking at the social impact of smart cities and how we can bring the world of social services together with the world of civic tech and tech for good and so on. So there are all these grassroots groups and communities in places across the country. So my first suggestion would be to really kind of invite them in to your organization, right? And say, hey, here's what kind of we're up to, in poverty reduction, in newcomer settlement, in what have you, financial literacy, etc. Let's kind of just like have an exchange, and those types of just totally informal, local exchanges are really going to trigger something bigger, something more intentional, something larger. So I would I don't have a kind of a here's the sort of the silver bullet approach or answer. And I think there's all kinds of guises that these relationships can take, but it's really about extending an invitation to folks to kind of come into your world, and there is so much that we need to kind of do from aligning values, to aligning language, to a bunch of other things, and those will come. And that's a big part of kind of our focus as well. Is ultimately it's not just about sort of, yes, I'm aware of artificial intelligence or virtual reality and all of this, but I now have the relationships and the language to activate something really interesting for my mission and for my organization.
Yeah, I think that's great, and that gets to a couple of points that you discussed earlier about not being just on defense, and it sounds weird saying offense in the terms of forming relationships on a casual basis, but it really is that sense of it, that you need to go meet people, and those relationships are what inform language. Because I can't tell you how many people I meet where I explain, working at the Tamarack Institute and my work, and I'll mention something about, for example, collective impact, and they'll be like, I have no idea what that actually means. Whereas if you're in the work of collective impact, it's a word you throw out without even thinking. And I'm sure in the realm of tech and artificial intelligence, the language barrier must be much higher. So that relationship forming, I think, would be much more important.
Yeah, and there's a language barrier on both sides, absolutely. But one of the really interesting things that both communities, both the tech community and the nonprofit charitable community, the NGO community is facing is there's a huge kind of issue around trust right now, right? And that, I think, is actually a really interesting kind of question to bring people together around. So, like, I think it was just about 2 weeks ago that there was a Gallup study released that said 52% of people around the world trust NGOs. 52%, right? And in Canada, it's 68%. Like, that's ridiculous, right? And so the 52%, that pretty much rivals like how many people trust. Like, about 50% of people don't trust banks or tech companies, right? So when we think about what is our trust agenda for the next decade, this is actually a really interesting I think bridge for us to bring the tech community with the NGO community together, because I think we both have some really important work to do around building trust.
That's great. And before we went live here on the discussion, you and I talked briefly about, for example, like the True North Tech for Good conference in Waterloo. And I know you've been going to a few conferences like this. Was there anything particular at True North or conferences or get-togethers like that particularly inspired you or gave you a special insight?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few things. I think True North was absolutely amazing, and I have not been to a tech conference like that in Canada, where we don't, they didn't really talk about hockey stick growth and exponential curves and so on, but there was a real sense of humility in the room. There was all kinds of conversations around fake news, to privacy, to surveillance, to peace tech and humanitarian tech, to Me Too, all kinds of really important questions that really frame, like, how is tech shaping our lives and our work, right? So, so this is the first time, I think, and it's really important that Canada, I think, is leading the conversation on this. So I think that's something that the world is actually expecting us to do. So, it was an amazing experience. What was lacking in that room, what I would say is there was an imbalance between who showed up, right? So it was about, I don't have the numbers exactly, but I would probably guess that it was significant majority of tech and a very small group of folks who are actively working in nonprofits and charities. So that's that we have to strike a balance with that. And I think, imagine the potential if you had 50% nonprofits and charities and 50% tech, right? Like, the conversation, the questions, the relationships, how people can come together around common issues and language, like, you'd blow that out of the water. So, for folks who are in the Southern Ontario region, I would highly recommend attending True North next year.
Wonderful. Why don't we move to our kind of final topic around the new meaning of money? So the question here is, how does the social sector become more shovel ready for impact investing, granting and raising money in a changing financial ecosystem?
Do you still use shovel ready? Is that still a term?
We pull it out of the closet every once in a while and dust it.
Okay. Yeah. So we need to be aware that giving, granting, investing, raising, sharing, like it's all changing because the finance ecosystem is changing, right? And so the questions that are of significance and will be of significance, I think, for the next decade is, there are questions like, what is money? Where does our money go? What does our money do? Who is it with? What is shared? What isn't shared? And we're really going back to sort of fundamentals on a lot of this, which is really exciting, but also incredibly daunting at the same time. And I'll briefly highlight sort of a few things that we're following and sort of capturing insights on for the world of social impact. And I'll start with crowdfunding. Right. So in the last few years, charitable donations grew about 6%, which is modest. It's good. It's still growing, right? Except crowdfunding grew about 35%. Like just it's an order of magnitude farther ahead than sort of your traditional charitable donation. So it's growing at a crazy pace. And the recent Senate report on the charitable sector talked about qualified donees and non-qualified donees and all of that. But there's an entire generation of people, again, who can't tell the difference between qualified and non-qualified donees, and nor do they care, right? So their entire sort of formative gift giving and giving habits are shaped by giving to non-qualified donees, right? And so this is a space to watch, and the growth of crowdfunding is really incredible, and not just in Canada but around the world, and it's only going to get bigger, more mainstream, and so when we sort of think about how we craft our fundraising campaigns. The trend, I think, is going to become that we start to blend traditional sort of fundraising and donor engagement with crowdfunding, and so that's something that is going to be super interesting to watch over the next little while. Another thing that I'll point out is digital currency, Bitcoin in particular, right? So for folks who don't know what Bitcoin is, it's a form of electronic cash. It's a decentralized digital currency without a central bank or a single central administrator, and it can be sent from user to user on a peer-to-peer network, so without the need for any intermediaries. And so to give you a sense of how fast the finance ecosystem is actually changing in Canada, awareness of Bitcoin, which is the largest digital currency in use right now, it grew from 64% to 85% just in the last year, right? And in the same period, ownership of Bitcoin, particularly among the sort of the 18 to 24 age group, grew the most, from 6 to 14%, right? So if you think about what this looks like played out over a decade, the government of Canada recently announced the Social Finance Fund, $755 million over 10 years, right? So by the time we are done dispersing the $755 million a decade from now, Bitcoin would be mainstream. Like that's the kind of pace that we're looking at, right? And what's super interesting is that there are already charities in Canada that accept Bitcoin donations. Like the first one was Pathways to Education. Right? It was the first charity to accept Bitcoin donations back in 2012. Right? Chimp, which is a charitable giving platform, they processed about $2.6 million equivalent in Bitcoin contributions just last year. right? So we, again, have to begin to kind of reorient ourselves and our craft of fundraising and donor development as the finance ecosystem is changing. So this is something that we're following quite closely. Anne Connolly, one of our contributors, wrote a really terrific analysis in Future of Good on Facebook's new digital currency, right? And its social impact effects. So, so that's of real interest for us. And we also, unpacked. Our team did a full analysis on the federal government's, social innovation and social finance strategy recommendations, and in particular, why digital currencies and crowdfunding have to be a part of this strategy implementation. So, a lot's happening on that front. And when we kind of look at the Social Finance Fund over the next 10 years and the rollout of that, by the time the whole thing gets rolled out, digital currencies like Bitcoin are going to be mainstream. So really interesting time and space right now. But we have to start thinking about what that means for our own fundraising campaigns, donor development, donor engagement, etc.
That's really interesting, and I like the point about Facebook's currency. A couple of questions just about what would you say? Do you have an example of someone who's doing crowdfunding well in the social change charitable space?
In what way? A platform or an organization?
Yeah, a platform or an organization that's taking advantage of that model. Do you have an example of anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this. I'd sort of reframe the question a little bit in that,
sure.
People sort of are giving to where their passions lie, right? And so it's not. I mean, yes, there are platforms that are specifically and exclusively for charities and not-for-profits, but generally speaking, people aren't seeking out those platforms. It's usually a sort of a push versus a kind of a pull, right? So what's happening broadly is people are really sort of giving to and supporting areas of passion for them, and that could take the form of a creative project. That could take the form of online movement. It could take the form of a not-for-profit. It could take the form of a co-op. It doesn't really matter. So the structure and how you organize yourself increasingly seems to be irrelevant. This is what we're seeing. But what really matters is how people are connected and how passionate they are to the ambition and the project.
That's great. Anything else you want to talk about here before we move on to a Q&A period on the meaning of money and any new technology here?
The one thing that I'll sort of mention is and this is a sort of it comes back to sort of like we don't have in the sort of the not-for-profit and charitable world, we don't have a strong culture of shaping the future. But it's so important, like now more than ever. We have to, and this means understanding what's ahead. Making sense of how we can bring that into our own work and our organizations, because I think as people practicing as craft of social change, we have to become organized around the future, or else we lose out on industries, on new technologies, on business models, on just engaging a particular demographic of people, all kinds of stuff, I'll kind of give you one quick example around that's more around sort of the emergence of a new industry, right? Yep. So if you take the cannabis industry, this is something that we knew was coming. Like we knew legalization was coming. Right? We knew about large companies getting set up. We knew lots of investment going into this, and it's not often that we see the birth of a new industry in this country, right? And we had the opportunity to shape an industry that is fair, that is equitable, that is energy efficient, that is, on and on and on, right? But we didn't. And by and large, there's a ton of, cannabis companies doing some really exceptional work and investing back in the community. But by and large, this industry looks like every other industry. And now we're seeing stories of working conditions popping up, wage inequity, high concentration of wealth, and on and on and on. So whether it's kind of the changing nature of work and work culture, or new industries that are emerging like cannabis, or new technologies, I think we have a huge opportunity to both shape and harness what's at the edges.
That's a great example too, because yeah, just having the chance to kind of almost have a do-over with a clean slate, and it looks exactly the same as everything else. That's I really like that example. Awesome. Well, why don't we transition here? We'll have a bit of a Q&A period. Thanks to everyone who submitted your questions so far throughout the presentation. If you're sitting on a question or even a comment, please feel free to type into the question box, and we'll try our best to get to it. Then I've got to say, overwhelmingly, the feedback we've heard or questions has to do with the idea of almost like getting involved. I'm not sure if that's the way to phrase it, with emerging new technology or trends, but being within a risk-averse organization. How can you speak to that tension of wanting to be involved in what's coming and what currently is, but being within an organization itself that might be risk-averse and skeptical of what's new?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. This is a really good question, and the way that I would sort of frame this, I suppose, to put a positive spin on it, is really looking at it through the lens of reducing risk. Because I think when we start talking about it in that way, I think at least in my experience, you have more veneer, you have more airtime, and there's a more of a sort of an inclination to sort of get engaged with what you're talking about. So framing, whether we're talking about new ways of working, gig economy, new types of benefits, whether it's activism in the workplace, whether it's new technologies and the adoption of new technologies, whatever it might be, I think looking at it from the lens of reducing risk, I think is really important. So when we talked about how Pathways to Education, as an example, accepts Bitcoin donations, folks sort of said to us, "Oh, it was really good to kind of read the journey of how they came to accept Bitcoin and how it's working. That was super insightful for us because no one wants to sort of be the sort of the first one, because it's how do you sort of get past this whole risk question, and two, you might as well learn from what others have already figured out, right? And so framing it in a sort of a reducing risk way, that's sort of why we do why we curate content in the way that we do, because we want folks to really navigate the changing landscape with confidence and with practical insights for people who have already figured it out.
Yeah, and it's true. Like even going back to one of the earlier points about activism in the workplace. In my mind, it's almost a question of like, what happens if we don't kind of lean into that? Does that change the makeup of who's on staff? Does that exclude certain groups of people that are really passionate about the work that they're pursuing? And it's almost a case of there's risk inherent in not leaning into it in the first place.
Yeah, and I can tell you, without naming organizations, there are a handful of organizations, both national and local, that I know of personally, that have lost staff because there was a very rigid stance that was taken. That listen, we are not an activist organization. We are not an advocacy organization. I can't give you time off to participate in a march. And so this is a really going back to the conversation and the question around how work is changing. This is going to become a part of our how we create social change, right? And even though it's become increasingly professionalized, this is sort of the new reality. And so we have to figure out a way to empower this in a healthy way, or else, yes, talent attraction, talent retention, this is going to be a big risk.
That's wonderful. We have a question coming in from Christy. and they ask or comment first. I teach in a human service management program, and we're developing a course for students to examine new technologies and how these technologies will influence the sector. What skills do you think emerging leaders require to support their organizations in these quotes here, digital transformation?
Yeah, really good question. There's kind of two ways to sort of answer that, I suppose. One is we actually don't know yet,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think just kind of this idea that we have a really good high sense of confidence of exactly what skills are required 10 years from now is just a bit of a myth. And so I think the biggest way to sort of come about that is to really look at horizontal skills and so not a sort of we've done the sort of the deep specialization. Now it's really about sort of very much sort of horizontal skills across technologies, across how to encourage and empower creativity, how to figure out and make sense of very complex situations and contexts. So these are the kinds of things that are going to matter. These are the kinds of things that machines will find really difficult or near impossible to do. But we have to better understand, and that's where I think the sort of the collective intelligence of humans and machines can get really powerful.
That's fantastic. One last question here before we move on to some final announcements. With the pace of what we're talking about and how quickly the tech can change, do you think that this will kind of transition us away from the idea of something like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan or a vision, just because of all the different iterations of change that we'll see within that time span?
Yeah. The pace of change is so fast today that we can't even imagine what our communities will look like 10 years from now, right? And so you take something like the UN Sustainable Development Goals as an example, which most folks are probably familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
There's 17 goals. 17 goal areas, sorry, and there's hundreds of markers and indicators. And the thing is that these the SDGs sunset in 2030. That's kind of the marker, right? And it doesn't feel like it's like it's not that far away, but no one has a clue what the world is going to look like in 2030.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're supposed to be solving for all of these things. And so how do you solve for saving for education when the education system is shifting so rapidly?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you solve for that? And like I have two kids, and we have RESP accounts that we've opened, but like we have no clue. Like this is like what learning and education is going to look like. And we're saving, investing, we're doing this, but there are so many families across the country who aren't able to do this, right? Don't have the capacity, the privilege, the resources to be able to participate in the same way that we're able to participate. But the education system is changing so profoundly. So for folks who are coming up with interventions, right, around preparing young people for the future, or helping parents save for their children's education, they really have to think about sort of the pace of change and figure out. And it's something that we just have to build a sort of a skill set around, is blending foresight with the problem solving.
That's wonderful. I really appreciate that response, just because, yeah, you do have to be kind of ready to change when need be, and looking for what's next. But yeah, just the idea that yeah, we really don't know what the world's going to look like, even in 5 years, let alone 10 or 15. So I think that's a really prudent response. We're going to transition now just for a couple quick next steps. I want to highlight for everyone on the call here, Future of Good. I really encourage you to check out the website futureofgood.co. There's lots going on, lots of great resources that Vinod mentioned on the call that we'll link to, including that article series on artificial intelligence. We'll also include a link to sign up to be an Impact Insider and receive news and publications and opportunities. Vinod, is there anything in particular that you want to highlight for Future of Good?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that there is right now all of our content is in the form of articles, but in the very near future we're going to be producing content in multiple formats, podcasts, infographics, videos, etc. So yes, please do go to the website, read and share the content, and sign up for Impact Insider. It's a beautifully designed weekly newsletter that thousands of people across the country are reading and have already made their one must read for the week.
Yeah, and as someone who helps design and publish the newsletter for Tamarack, I can say that the Future Good newsletter is excellent. It's a great standard to strive towards. One other opportunity that we have is our Community Change Festival. That's Tamarack's kind of marquee learning event for the year. It's taking place September 30th to October 3rd in Vancouver, BC. And it's a really cool opportunity to celebrate the great community change work that's being done both across Canada, but also with our friends and partners across the US and New Zealand and Australia. And we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into the 5 interconnected practices that we've identified as essential to community change. And those are things like evaluating impact, community engagement, collective impact, collaborative leadership, and community innovation. You can follow the link on your screen or in the email that we'll send out to learn more about that learning opportunity. And you can learn more about upcoming events and free webinars like this one at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also encourage you to take a minute to complete a very short survey that will be prompted to complete at the end of this webinar. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this particular webinar and any future topics that you'd like us to cover. And a huge thank you again to Vinod for joining us and sharing your insight. I really appreciate what you had to share here.